Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Mario Theriger and welcome to the last part, I think, of this short series on waterscapes in Nordic mythology, finishing now with the water spirit Näck and Strömkarl of Swedish folklore. On the previous video I have mostly focused on Icelandic and Norwegian folklore concerning water spirits that gives us an understanding of the Nykr, the metamorphic water spirit, and now I would like to briefly focus on the Swedish folklore concerning such an entity so we can have other examples and information that further establishes an idea about the cognitive perception of Nordic peoples towards bodies of water and the emotions and fears connected to water, which has developed a rich body of folkloric traditions which by themselves reflect past traumas and experiences of Nordic peoples in relation to water. If you haven't watched the previous videos, well, I suggest that you do, just to better understand the cultural, religious, mythological and folkloric backgrounds of the forms in which the Näck and the Strömkarl choose to appear. Let's get straight to it, because this video serves as a sort of an attachment video or to the third part of this short series, a sort of fourth part, right? Let's start with the Näck, one of the versions of the Nykr, but in Swedish folklore. According to Swedish folklore, the Näck sometimes appears in the form of an adult man and is particularly dangerous to snobbish and sassy maidens. Sometimes also appears in the form of an attractive young man with his lower extremities like those of a horse, sometimes like an old man as well with a long beard, and occasionally as a handsome youth with blonde curls falling over his shoulders and a red hat, sitting on a summer night on the surface of the water with a golden harp in his hand. Therefore, here we see that the forms assumed by the Näck sway between a human figure, a human form, young, adult, old, and non-human form, that of an animal, a horse. All of the forms assumed by this entity are male. A notable variation between Norwegian and Swedish folklore refers to the victims of these water entities. As stated in the previous video, the Nykr, Norwegian folklore, when taking the form of a horse, is particularly dangerous for children or towards children, while the Näck, Swedish folklore, under the guise of a man or a half-horseman, is dangerous to maidens, to damsels. In Swedish folklore, the Nykr also takes on the form of a horse to attract victims and drown them. It is important to point out that there are legends related to the riding of the Nykr throughout Sweden, according to which the Nykr receives the names of Beklahest in Götaland, mainly in Skåne county, also the designation of Näck in Svealand and Hjoro in Norrland. However, it is commonly referred to be a female water spirit, at least this last one, which is quite curious. Therefore, the tale or the folkloric tales of the ride on the Beklahest or the Näck in horse form is found throughout Sweden. However, the center of the tradition is thought to be Skåne, since that is the center of distribution of the term Beklahest. In central Sweden, however, the water horse is the Näck, and in north of Sweden it is the Hjoro. By the way, Götaland, not to be confused with Gotland. Götaland as one of the three lands of Sweden and comprises 10 provinces, so I'm talking about mainly southern Sweden, right? Just to make it clear. Therefore, we see that in Sweden there are some variations, not only in terms but also in the gender that the Nykr assumes, as well as the victims he chooses, but it seems that there is a consensus, that is the connection to the horse, once again, as we have seen and as I have explained in the previous video in relation to cultural and religious factors around the horse. Now, most of those who ride the Nykr are children, but many variants also reference or make reference to a single adult, and such legends don't always end in the tragic death of the victim. Local variations does not necessarily reflect controversies in mythology or folklore, mind you, but may indicate changes in the meaning of certain elements according to locality and how the people from such localities deal with and perceive the environment in which they live, both natural and social environments. The death or survival of the victims of the Nykr, for example, may be related to the content of the message conveyed by the legend itself, by the folk tale, presenting preventive or moralistic character. In the case of children, it seems to be more on the grounds of a preventive or a protective type of content, and in the case of maidens, of damsels, it seems to indicate something more on the grounds of social and religious morals. I'll put a note right here, don't worry. Now, the horse is one of the appearances assumed by the Nykr that stands out the most for its similarities with legends from other regions and cultures. I think it is important to highlight at least three common factors about the horse, also reflected in Irish and Icelandic tales and myths. The horse is associated with, or it has impressive strength. The horse is used as a working horse in usually associated with a major construction or an otherworldly project to construct a big structure, and the color grey would be a property of supernatural horses in these types of folklore. I'm sure it has already occurred to you the Norse mythology horse Svaldifari, said to have immense strength, used to construct the wall of the home of the Aesir in Asgard, and Svaldifari will father a horse with Loke, and that supernatural horse with 8 legs is called Sleipnir, which is grey in color precisely. In the Irish legend of Saint Mong of Ferns, as one example, he raised the walls of the cathedral to the wall plate in one single night. There's a grey horse involved, which brings the last load along the side of the hill. Curiously, just a side note in relation to saints in the construction of huge buildings, in Scandinavian folklore, saints are frequently assisted by trolls in the erection of their churches, still demonstrating this employment of supernatural entities in raising big monuments. And the Irish legend of Saint Mog, as an example, can be compared with the previously mentioned Asgard wall myth, a huge wall, in late Icelandic mythological accounts, which reminds us, of course, of the Irish mythological creature often also associated with water, which is the Kelpie or the Kelpie, which can also be found in workhorse legends and folkloric tales as supernatural beings aiding in the construction of a major project of some religious or other worldly structure. The roles of the horse in Old Norse sources demonstrate that the horse had a dual nature, that it was never purely good or evil, and that its transcendent role could serve both purposes. This characterization, in turn, is consistent with the beliefs of Old Norse religiosity and several belief systems, which did not polarize anything into the category of good and evil. There's never this structure or this structured idea of good versus evil, right? In fact, the earliest Old Norse mythological accounts always make it clear, quite clear, that nothing is truly dualistic in nature, but rather a constant flow of orderly and chaotic factors and forces that keep constructing the cosmos and everything else in it. And the sagas and obviously in the Eddic poetry, horses are also associated with water, quite frequently actually, and are able to cross all sorts of boundaries, especially bodies of water, giving quite the supernatural abilities to horses, and so the horse becomes this iconographic religious element of transcendence. It is interesting to note the liminal aspects of the maritime cultural landscape and the allusion to horses in maritime cultures, especially from folkloric sources, which intersect in the practices of sailors, ship names, place names, and rock art that refer to the horse. You see, liminal states act on several cognitive dimensions, and in Nordic culture, the horse is an animal that plays a liminal role in human cognition. Even in Norse mythology, obviously, the horse acts as a psychopomp, the case of Sleipnir, as an example, being able to transport gods between realms inaccessible by ordinary means, often overcoming water barriers, whether seas, rivers, or lakes. And these aspects of ancient Norse religiosity continue to be present in folklore, namely in the figure of the Nykr in the form of a horse, when it assumes the horse form and this need to drown people or take them to bodies of water. The appearance of the Nykr in the form of a horse on water surfaces immersed in a context related to death illustrates fragments of a long-standing imaginary in the Nordic traditions. In this sense, the Nykr in folklore reconciles some perspectives of ancient Nordic religiosity and belief systems with medieval and contemporary aspects of the social imaginary, culminating in variations that not only survived but also developed and adapted in the following centuries. But this is something I've already talked about in the previous videos of these short series and other videos I've done throughout this channel. But I think it is important to remember those aspects and once again to reflect on the importance of folklore as a discipline that should be included, in my opinion, in the study of the sciences of religions, because several cognitive processes of past human societies remain and are developed through time, and through folklore we have very useful perceptions towards the mind of ancient cultures, and as such we can better understand such past cultural conceptions and belief systems and the emotions and cognitive processes that instigated the formation and construction of these myths and folk tales. So basically, as we have seen in the previous videos, a number of factors contributed to the elaboration of folkloric versions of the Nykr, the metamorphic Nordic spirit of the water, such as social and moral conceptions, the perception of bodies of water, and the formation of the cognitive landscape of water, different belief systems, and the imaginary of each region, population, and social group. Each legend meets the demands of the group that shares it, whether in the moral sense or in the religious and social environment, and it is possible to infer symbolisms and the different perceptions of the world from them, from such accounts, from such folkloric tales. The Näck also stands out for being a water spirit with a musical attribution to it, similar to the Fossegrim from Norwegian folklore that we have seen in the previous video. But we also have sacrificial connotations. According to legends, if anyone wishes to learn music from the Näck, the best gift in exchange for such skills that can be offered to this entity is a black lamb, especially if the person hopes for the salvation of the black lamb, which apparently the Näck takes this sentiment into consideration if this sentiment is obviously expressed to it, to the water spirit, which is curious. After all, the Näck takes into consideration the more protective and even affection or affectionate sentiments from the part of the person towards the animal that is being offered, and as such the animal may be spared. We must take into account here that the lamb is a wildly significant animal in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and in this context the choice for the black lamb reveals a highly symbolic connotation of, or in the cultural process through which this animal went through in Scandinavia. Mind you that the sheep and the goat in Old Norse paganism or heathendom was already present before Judeo-Christian religious influences, obviously. But, for example, and for this very reason, the sheep, the animal sheep, was preserved in Christianity as the symbolic element of the sacrificial lamb. That is, it was transformed into a Christian symbol, different from the goat, which, like the horse, was demonized. Of course, we are dealing with various cultural religious processes. The lamb was the animal sacrificed in the temple of the god Yahweh, Jehovah, among Semitic peoples in a more remote time when this deity still had a wife, a goddess who was also highly venerated among Semitic peoples. Curiously, one of the animal forms in which this deity, this god, appeared in the temple was precisely a goat, or a male goat. But this sacrifice of the lamb remains in a Christian religious context, and to this day, actually, throughout Europe, the lamb is consumed in certain religious celebrations, so it still continues to be sacrificed, unfortunately. And this is clearly reflected in the folklore of each country. So here the offering or the sacrifice of a black lamb to the Näck, to the water spirit, we see the non-pagan religious connotations that influenced the moral, religious, social, and in general the Scandinavian cultural context. These cultural aspects, like mythologies, do not develop in isolation, obviously, but in contact with other mythologies, other cultural aspects, being affected by borrowing elements, adopting conceptions and belief systems, and contacts with other mythologies and respective practices. See that all peoples create their cultural contexts, obviously, there's no dispute, but culture is never a reality that stagnates precisely because human populations have always been in contact with each other and sharing various cultural and linguistic contexts. Our own languages reflect this. I think it's a good example. Our languages that are a fusion of different languages from different peoples that influence our way of expressing ourselves, and it's the same thing with culture in general. Well, this version of the black lamb as an animal to be sacrificed to the Näck and the Strömkarl as well is an example of the complex religious imbrication present in 19th century Nordic folklore, which involves conceptions of Old Norse and Christian religion, right? It is important to say that with regard to sacrificial rites, just as a note, these consist of a human sacrifice in which a gift is offered to supernatural beings, be they gods, goddesses, spirits, other entities, ancestors, etc., with the purpose of establishing with them a relationship or bond in order to provoke a beneficial and propitious action or a beneficial outcome. In Northern European folklore, certain black-colored animals tend to symbolize bad omen or negative beings, or if not even malefic. We talked about this in the previous video, for example, in relation to the black dog in the English folklore. The black lamb, in particular, could allude to the sacrifice within Abrahamic religions, symbolizing an inversion of values of the sacrificial lamb due to the emphasis on the color black, stigmatized in folk beliefs, and for being offered to a nature spirit rather than the Christian deity. It is thus black in color to symbolize this unholy value to it. So here the context is Judeo-Christian, but the color determines something negative, an inversion of the religious morals of this context. Instead of the redemption of sins of the supplicant, the sacrifice to the water spirit would serve the purpose of gaining self-advantage, learning to play music from the neck. However, in other versions, when the sacrifice is also mentioned, it can also involve a black cat, a child, a young goat, money, or a piece of horse meat. The horse, among other animals, the dog too, was a sacrificial animal in Old Norse religion, and the consumption of its meat in a sacrificial meal was a deeply rooted custom that took on important symbolic meaning for paganism in its conflict with Christianity. The thing is, folk traditions or folk tradition in general has passed on the aversion towards eating horse meat, with the claim that the horse was a pagan sacrificial animal, and therefore the Christian Church wanted to eradicate the ritual consumption of horse meat for good. So, when we see the offering of horse meat to this water spirit in late Nordic folklore, not only we find remnants of a pagan past, but we also see the Christian folk tradition towards the aversion of consuming horse. So if one of the preferable means of consumption of a nature spirit is horse meat, something Christianity specifically forbade, it is giving us a perception of very much Christian moral values towards the understanding of this spirit. However, in times of food shortage and famine, of course, horse meat was allowed in some regions of the north after Christianity, but perhaps the legends evoking the offering of this type of meat to the water spirit refer to the ideas and traditions of Old Norse religion, a subject that has been discussed here before on other videos. We have to take into account that in this type of folklore, especially when something animate or inanimate is given to a spirit in exchange for something else, we are in the presence of pre-Christian belief systems. Dealings with spirits belonged to a popular tradition of pre-Christian origin. So the color black, the types of meat or taboos on meat and types of animals may present a Judeo-Christian moralistic understanding, but the content itself, the action, the core of the folklore, which is an interaction with the spirit of nature, is very much pre-Christian. Nature spirits who previously expressed an ambiguous character, could be both beneficial and malefic, came to be seen as creatures of demonic origins in later folklore, and any relationship with them was condemned. This is an important point for us to understand through folklore, of course, to understand the changes in human thought in relation to certain religious morals, which in turn changed people's perceptions of the world. This also serves to understand the fusion of beliefs and what constitutes a pagan origin and what social and cultural changes have overlapped. Demonization was a strategy that had already been employed by the medieval church, of course, but here we see that it gained strength in Swedish society only at the beginning of the modern age, more or less in the 16th century, sorry, with the emergence of a centralized government in symbiosis with the Lutheran Church. Through demonization, supernatural entities of modern popular culture were often identified with the devil and its demons. Right, when a person had a disease which it was not possible to diagnose, the cause was attributed to the spirit of the place where the disease was contracted or was supposed to be contracted. In these cases, according to Swedish folklore, the Näck must be propitiated by pouring a drink into a cup and mixing it with the scrapings from the wedding ring made of silver, brass, or any other metal possessed by inheritance, so that the odd number, particularly the number 3, can be observed. With this mixture, people go to the place where the disease is supposed to have been contracted and spill the mixture over the left shoulder. By the way, on the way there to the place, they must not turn around or utter any sound. If there is any uncertainty as to the place, the spill is done on the doorpost or the doorknob or in an anthill. Attributing the cause of a disease to the Näck, this spirit of nature, reinforces the negative character of the water spirit, but perhaps, above all, it indicated the human need to justify what is unknown. It is interesting to see this understanding even in the 19th century still, that the contraction of a disease would have occurred through the contact of the sick person with a spirit, or rather, the person becomes sick through the contact with the place where such a spirit entity inhabits. Thus, there would be a relation of proximity between the place and the spirit. And the contact with the spirit would serve as a principle of malefic outcome, a person becoming cursed, becoming a victim of maleficia. We continue to understand this religious sense of prohibition to form any relationship or having any contact with spirits and natural places, since such practices of pagan origins were forbidden by the church, and once again, the demonization of spirits, places, and actions towards such spirits and places was a means to prevent people from turning back to their old customs and old belief systems. There are also interesting folkloric tales that tells us about the imprisonment of the neck, usually involving its horse form and binding it, or in some way capturing it or trying to imprison it. The horse in folkloric narratives of the supernatural, dealing here with the Nykr, and which we can in a way compare with the Kelpie or the Kelpie water spirit from Scottish folklore, which also takes on the form of a horse to attract victims and drown them. Both the Nykr, Norwegian Nykr, and the Kelpie and the Swedish Näck can be controlled by human constructed utensils made of iron, a bridle and the plough, harness, etc., which locks them into the horse shape for which such implements were designed. As a consequence, they use their driving force to plough the field until at some point they manage to free themselves and return to their habitat, a river or a lake. In these legends, the intention of imprisoning the water spirit prevails in order to obtain advantages in agrarian life. Of course, as mentioned in the previous video, we are faced with the importance of certain technological developments that have had a great impact on the lives of human populations. Here we are, or we have an allusion, or we are faced with an allusion to the horse as an animal used to plow the fields, which coincides with one of the technological innovations that revolutionized agricultural work, animal traction. Compared to human labor, animal labor has a much better performance and more economically cheap, easy and better from the perspective of human societies, obviously. The water spirit imprisoned in its horse form, whose strength was the key element to be used in this performance, or through this performance, is an interesting allusion that shows us important elements of societies, and in this case of Nordic societies. The imaginary is always composed of images plus conceptions. That is, mental images translated into cognitive associations, which in turn express conceptions of a collective scope in a given society. These legends were transmitted in rural communities in a manner consistent with the experience of such communities. And taking this into consideration, it is possible that the versions of the imprisonment of the water spirit reflected the possibility of mastering natural environments with appropriate techniques and instruments. It's not just the human need to control and domesticate animals to use them to its advantage, but the very control and domestication of the natural environments themselves. Another variation of Swedish folklore refers to the Nykr by the name of Strömkarl, riverman. He is described as a Näck who lives under a bridge or in a river, a type of Nykr spirit, a water spirit, who specifically lives under a bridge or in a stream, is commonly called a Strömkarl. He plays the violin. He is depicted as an old man sitting on a rock, taking out water from his long green beard. His appearance is said to foretell a storm. He is sometimes seen on the beach in the form of a beautiful horse with its legs reversed, just as we have seen in Icelandic folklore in relation to this water spirit. The Strömkarl version takes up some possible appearances of the Nykr, the form of an elderly bearded man, or an unusual horse with turned hooves or reversed hooves. Also noteworthy, it is its appearance associated with the forecast and or arrival of storms, similar to the Søtroll of Norwegian folklore that we talked about in the previous video. Therefore, according to some Nykr legends or in folktales, the appearance of certain aquatic creatures from mythology and folklore would be associated with the arrival of storms. It is not uncommon for the social imaginary to link the nature of mythologies or the nature of mythological water beings to the control of weather or the advent of bad weather. The relationship between storms and maritime entities implies the idea of imminent danger, and perhaps even death when there are human lives on water surfaces. Folkloric and mythological sources mention rites practiced by sailors and fishermen that aim at the collaboration of aquatic entities in maritime voyages. Such entities would be capable both of granting safe travel through the control of waves and weather, and of favoring fishing. The aquatic environment is configured as an opportune medium for various purposes, such as a source of food, hygiene, pleasure, economic and other social gains, among others, but the risk of losing one's life in a body of water is constant. It is a primordial fear, especially when in contact with unknown and chaotic environments such as water, deep lakes, and the vast sea. Mythological aquatic creatures, deities, spirits, etc., embody and expand the fear that is aroused by bodies of water. The cognitive landscape, therefore, becomes inhabited by constructs of the social imaginary that require certain behaviors of those who submit to its dominions. We saw this in the previous video regarding offerings and sacrifices to the water spirits that form a link with Norse deities such as Odin and Njordr. So I don't think it will be necessary to reflect on that again. Basically, we see a long tradition of sacrifices and offerings to water entities in order to create some beneficial outcome, if not simply as a means of survival. And this continues to be seen in later folklore, in which dangers could be averted by or through ritual magic. Well, going back to the Strömkarl, he has a musical character that is often linked to strong Christian precepts, since his song alludes to his hope for salvation. Protestantism was adopted in Sweden in the 16th century between the 1520s and the 1530s. In Sweden, we do not have any real knowledge of exactly how and when the first Reformed Mass was celebrated. It is likely, however, that it happened in Stockholm during the latter half of the 1520s. From then on, the Lutheran Church began to exercise strict control over the religious, social, and economic spheres. The Bible, interpreted by the Orthodox Protestant priests, and Luther's catechism, read and memorized by everybody, were the official guidelines for a good Christian life in Sweden. Annual catechetical examinations of all persons above the age of 7 took place to ensure that these duties were fulfilled and that nothing was forgotten later in life. Since the Middle Ages, tithing, the practice of taking or paying a tithe, a tax for the support of the church and clergy, has been an important part of the tax system in most regions of Europe. The priest himself was an active farm manager living next door to the peasants paying the tithes. This is important to understand because there are a lot of legends and folkloric tales in which the figure of the religious shepherd or priest, a pastor, comes in contact with the Näck, with the water spirit. In fact, we saw in the previous video that the figure of a priest is presented as the only means of salvation and protection against these types of spirits, capable of banishing or even killing this type of water spirit. Initially, the priest dominates the water spirit, who was playing a stringed instrument in the form of a half-naked, handsome young man. The priest understands this meeting as an opportunity to evangelize, so he goes to the place where the Näck was and consoles him, preaching about his salvation. These types of versions of Nykr folklore, while demonstrating, of course, a clash between ancient traditions represented by the water spirit and the new religion, Protestantism, represented by the priestly figure, also reveal the complex imbrication of beliefs in spirits of nature with Christian doctrine. Folk narrative plays an essential part in social and cultural life. An effort of the science of folklore is to uncover how traditional narratives or how traditional narration reflects and affects the spiritual life and conduct of human beings. In these narratives, the existence of the Näck is not contested by the priest. That is, its appearance is assumed to be real. In the logic of the narrative, therefore, the priest, the pastor, and the water spirit coexist and interact, and this was accepted by the audience within this tradition. The Näck is portrayed as submissive, yearns for his salvation, and at no time threatens the pastor's life. The pastor, or in some other versions, the priest, or a shepherd, religious shepherd, in turn is not attracted to the water spirit, unlike the great majority of people who often fall into the charms of this water spirit. On the contrary, it seems to impose itself against him, exerting an influence on his way of acting. Even if the existence of the water spirit were or wasn't accepted in this aspect, it would be subject to Christian doctrine nonetheless. In folklore, we also see the existence of wells that were intended for offerings to the Näck, to the water spirit. According to folklore, at certain times of summer, money, iron, or any metal was cast as an offering. People threw metallic things into the well as offerings to the Näck. Apotropaic rites against the Näck are markedly present in front of wells and in certain circumstances, such as bathing in the sea, protecting unbaptized children, and healing sick people even, metal objects were thrown into wells as apotropaic rites. For instance, when bathing in the sea, a person should place fire steel or a knife or something similar in the water next to the person to prevent any monster from hurting the person. On getting out of the water, the person took the steel again, saying, and it was not uncommon during the bath to address the spirit of the water scornfully, and with the following words, Näck, Näck, nale putta, du på land, men jag i vann. Näck, Näck, needle thief, you are on land, but I am in the water. It was also not uncommon that a fire steel or a pair of scissors was laid on the cradle of a child for protection of the child until the child was Christianized through baptism. We see here the belief that Christianization was understood as the ceremony that would ensure protection against evil spirits. So unbaptized babies were open to be taken or even killed by evil spirits. Or the custom of pouring melted silver or other metals on a pot, when it was believed that the person is suffering from the work of the evil one. By pouring melted metal, especially silver, the injury is also poured out. That's the essence of it. I've given some examples of this in relation to the practice of the wise one, the Kloke in Swedish folklore, in the video concerning the malevolent witch, Hexan. Melted metal for divinatory purposes or to predict the illness of a person and thus cure it. We have a series of metal objects that served as protective charms against evil spirits. Not only I have spoken about these cases and the case of the needle, in the previous video, but also in the video I have done about the troll cross. And though the troll cross itself is a recent iconographic symbol for protection against trolls, something as recent as the 1990s, it is still implicit this older tradition and belief of metals as mediums for protection against entities that in later folklore also considered to either be evil spirits or the devil himself, or the devil itself. As discussed during this mini-series of Waterscapes in Nordic mythology, water can convey the idea of a boundary, providing a barrier between the mundane dimension and other worldly realms or dimensions. Apotropaic rites would be performed through offerings or carrying metallic objects. A feature that stands out in these rites concerns the attribution of power to metal. Among the rites discussed here and in the previous video, those aimed at protecting children not yet baptized stand out. The infant mortality rate was high in Sweden as well, declining only after 1810 with the advent of smallpox vaccination, because, science isn't always about controlling people through fear. It has saved millions of lives over the past 2 centuries, at least, with several vaccines. Of course, the causes of mortality were the most diverse in Nordic societies, as in so many other societies. However, deaths by accident, or at least by unnatural means, the highest were by drowning in Nordic countries, and of course occupied a prominent place in the Nordic social imagination for many centuries, associating this type of death with water entities. This can be traced back to mythological references such as the context of death related to the goddess Ran. Deaths by drowning were accidents that often occurred with children and occurred in ponds, rivers, pit holes. Pit holes were and still are a danger to both humans and animals, or in the sea itself, usually in the vicinity of the victim's home. In fact, there are several diaries and reports of these types of deaths in Scandinavia. Even a simple bath in the sea and the person drowned. So, taking into account the amount of infant mortality and deaths by drowning, it seems to me a collective trauma that is present in the mentality of the populations of Scandinavia, and for that reason is registered in folklore, combining it with other fears, religious morals and traditional folk magic and practical behaviors, ancient and new rites, as well as the survival of past religious elements and beliefs that still hold relevance within the collective mentality. It is not difficult, I think, to understand this construction of the imaginary of Scandinavian societies over time. I think it is enough to even look at the geography of Sweden, as well as of other Scandinavian countries, which is characterized by the presence of numerous rivers and lakes, which allows a great number of accidents and subsequent death by drowning. Given this, it is not at all strange to think that the Nykr, the metamorphic Nordic water spirit, in folklore has escalated to justify such fatalities in regions of constant contact with bodies of water. Sometimes we make too much of an effort to find a meaning for certain mythological and folkloric elements, but sometimes it is as simple as looking at the landscape and try to picture people's relationship with the landscape itself, especially when we are dealing with more animistic worldviews of past societies whose livelihood was very much in constant contact with the natural world, the natural environment and its landscapes. But of course, it should be noted that these legends and folk tales are not limited to deaths and accidents only, nor do they focus on infant mortality all the time, which, despite having a high rate, varied from region to region. Regional differences would have shaped folkloric variations of the Nykr as well, and its and as it has been conceived, how the water spirit has been conceived and its actions in different ways, right? Thus, for a more in-depth study about the Nykr, it is necessary to analyze the legends, myths, and folk tales with respect to the context of each region in order to identify possible social cultural factors that would have contributed to the development of particularities of beliefs and rites related to the water spirit. After all, adaptation was made when it was necessary to conserve old customs in new conditions or using old models for new purposes. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that sometimes we don't have to try to look so hard for a very deep meaning from the corner of our imagination. Sometimes the simple observation of geographic and social cultural contexts already gives us enough clues for the formation of cognitive processes that are revealed in mythology and folklore. Frankly, and also sadly, a big percentage of folklore accounts present human trauma. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this short series, and I very much hope the information was useful. Anything you would like to add, go ahead. Share information. I'm always eager to learn more and exchange information with all of you. Share some insight, experiences, and existential crisis, let me know. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time and your patience. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell, my dear friends.